Excellent. I think we have a lot of people on the call now, so let's start. But good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us. Thank you for joining us on the call today. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping points. When joining the internet link, you will have been given the option of joining through your computer's audio or dialing in via the telephone. If you have difficulty connecting to the audio, please message the Centre for Science and Security Studies host using the chat box. On a PC or a laptop, the chat box is on the right-hand side. If you're using a phone or a tablet, you'll have to toggle the view to see this. To manage the session, this is all one-way audio. All participants are currently muted, so if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. If you're using a PC or laptop, the Q&A button is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're using a smartphone or tablet, you may have to toggle to see this, so please have a quick look now. Please also use the opportunity to ensure that the slides are visible and minimize any features, such as participant videos, that you may find distracting. I should also note that this presentation will use polls. All polls are anonymous, so please do not worry about this when you're voting. Today's session is called Combating the Cyber Threat, an IT Perspective. It's planned to last for 45 minutes with a questions and answer session at the end. The session is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the session. At the end of the session, there will also be a short questionnaire for your feedback. Please do take the time to fill this out. Now, without any further delay, I'm pleased to announce we're today joined by Mr. Rakesh Bergal. Rakesh has worked in the nuclear sector in the United Kingdom for 33 years and currently works for International Nuclear Services, INS, where he has served as the Chief Information Security Officer for 5 years. Rakesh, thanks for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Carl. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to friends and colleagues around the globe. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to chat to you this morning. And as I say, my name is Rakesh Bergal. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for INS. In case you didn't know, INS is International Nuclear Services, a global transporter of nuclear materials. So we have 3 nuclear vessels that transport nuclear materials up to and including category 1 nuclear materials around the world. And part of my job is to protect INS corporate networks, but also to protect the networks, both IT and operational technology, on board our 3 nuclear cargo vessels, which are based out of Barrow-in-Furness in the United Kingdom. So I'm absolutely delighted to speak to you today on this topic, combating cyber insider and IT perspective. I should say that I would normally steer clear of technical terms, but since this is an IT perspective on this insider threat, then I will necessarily have to get somewhat technical. This will happen more towards the end of the presentation, and I've no doubt there'll be IT professionals in the audience today who perhaps will also know a lot about this, and I may wish to lean on you for technical aspects of this towards the end as well. So without any further ado, I'll carry on with the presentation now. So what I thought I'd do is just present to you the agenda. I'm just going to talk about what the learning objectives are going to be in the next slide. We necessarily have to look at definitions, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on definitions. I'm kind of hoping that you understand what the insider threat is and how it's defined. So I'm not going to go too deeply into that, and I'm assuming that you're more interested in the IT aspect of it and how, from a cybersecurity perspective, we would protect against the insider. I'm then going to look at the case of Chelsea Manning, and we'll then look at some exfiltration methods. So methods by which data and information can be removed from where it should be to where it shouldn't really be. Then we'll have a look at the IT good practice in relation to the insider threats. I'll only cover the IT good practice as it relates to the insider threat. There are plenty more controls which relate really more to external threat than internal threat. So I'll just be concentrating on the internal threat. And then we'll look at a review and some conclusions at the end, and there'll be some time for questions and answers too. And I'm hoping by the end of this, you're going to leave this session, you'll be able to describe an outline of the Chelsea Manning case and perhaps understand some of the methods used by insiders to exfiltrate information. But I'd also like you to be able to go away, go back to your organizations and define and devise some strategies to prevent such exfiltration happening in the first place and prevent the insider threat. Before I actually do that, perhaps I could get an idea of who's in the audience. So if I could ask Hannah to bring up a poll, there's going to be a poll now coming up on your screens. I'll give you a few seconds to answer this question, and it'll give me a bit of an idea of who I'm talking to. Yeah, I think that's just over half of us voted. I'll just give us a few more seconds. Okay, I'll end the poll there. That's about 70% of us. So it looks like, for the most part, we are mostly managers here. We've got 5 cybersecurity professionals, no IT professionals, and we have 1 who's in the executive and C-suite. So I think I'm going to tone my presentation more towards being less technical, if you like. Unfortunately, I will have to use some technical terms. So let's move on from there. Just moving to the next slide. So let's start with the definitions here. So an insider is an individual who has legitimate access to organizational assets, and who accidentally or deliberately for unauthorized purposes. And there's quite a few key words in here that I've underlined. So legitimate, for example, I've underlined that, and that is, it's somebody who's been given access because we have given them that access because we think they need that access. So they legitimately have that access to those assets. And then assets themselves, well, these could be hard or soft assets. So hard assets being things like buildings, cars, computers, USB sticks, and soft assets like ideas or reputation. I consider those things to be soft assets too. Accidentally or deliberately releasing, well, we've seen examples of those happening. So for example, if you sent an email with an attachment that you shouldn't have attached to that email and you send it outside of the company, then that's an accidental way that you could get information outside of the company where it shouldn't be. Or deliberate, of course, that would be somebody on the inside of a company deliberately doing that kind of thing. And we're going to talk about Chelsea Manning shortly. I use the word compromise. Compromise is, I define it myself as a state where it's out of control of the organization. So if it's out of control of the organization, then that information is potentially compromised. And the final thing is that it's used for unauthorized purpose. So all information within an organization has a purpose, it has value. And if that information is compromised and used for something that it was never intended to be used for, then that for me is an unauthorized purpose. So I'm hoping you're aware of this definition anyway. I just thought I'd revisit it just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of definition. From a cyber perspective, and we've talked a little bit about this, legitimate access usually means authorized access to IT networks. So if you legitimately have access to an IT network, then from a cyber perspective, that's relevant from an insider threat perspective. Assets usually mean the information that's on the IT networks. And as I said before, it could be hard assets as well, but information in terms of documents, spreadsheets, that sort of thing. Accidental or deliberate acts on the network, I've already talked about that. And compromise in the context of cyber and in the context of what I'm talking about here usually means a leak of information. In other words, the information leaks out of the company and out of the company's control. Unauthorized, again, we've talked about this, usually means you do something with the information that you're not meant to do. So that's my cyber perspective on it. So moving on now, the pictures you see here are actually the same person. So on the left is Bradley Manning, and on the right is Chelsea Manning. So at some point in Bradley's life, Bradley changed her sex to a female and is now known as Chelsea Manning. And you might hear me use the terms Chelsea and Bradley throughout this presentation. I mean the same person. I mean no disrespect to anybody by using both of those names. But there's a question of time here, historic time and current time. So I might use different words here. The fact that Bradley changed his sex to female, to Chelsea, is actually relevant in this case because it has to do with state of mind. And I'm going to talk about that state of mind as we go through the presentation. So a bit of background, and this is an overview of the actual case, this particular slide, and we'll go into a bit more detail beyond this. So Bradley had gender identity issues, as I've said, and changed his sex to female and his name from Bradley to Chelsea. And as part of a role in the US Army, she actually had legitimate access to confidential information. So here we talk about, in the definition, you remember, legitimate access. So she actually did have legitimate access to confidential information. And what she did was she collected this information, and I'm going to talk about what sort of information it was slightly later, exfiltrated it and released it to the WikiLeaks website. If you don't know what WikiLeaks is, just Google it on the internet. It is a site that you can submit information to, and that will leak that information and make it public. So that's an overview of the case. There's a timeline associated with. So Manning enlisted in the US Army in 2007, and in 2009 she was promoted to a specialist. She was actually a specialist in intelligence, and therefore you might imagine she had access to very sensitive information. In 2010, for reasons that I'll talk about shortly, she downloaded over 700,000 documents that belonged to the US Army. She wrote them to a CD, and she marked that CD Lady Gaga in order to kind of disguise that CD, perhaps as pop music of some sort. Sorry, no disrespect to Lady Gaga, it is pop music, not pop music of some sort. And she smuggled that CD out and later copied that information to her personal computer. So there's some deliberate acts there, taking something that she wasn't authorized to take in the way that she took it, smuggling it out of a controlled environment, and then copying that information. She released a copy of that information to WikiLeaks, and in doing so, she got into conversation with Julian Assange, who was the founder of WikiLeaks and who is famous or infamous as WikiLeaks leader. And in kind of talking to Julian Assange, she became very, very friendly with him. So, and then if we continue the timeline, in May of 2010, after the information was released to WikiLeaks, Manning, for some reason, contacted Adrian Lamo, a grey hat hacker. If you've been to my cyber presentations before, I talk about black hat, grey hat, and white hat hackers. So black hats being the probably the criminal end and who just don't care about the law at all. White hats being the ethical hackers, people like myself and other cyber professionals probably online in this presentation as we speak. And the grey hat ones are a bit dubious. They sometimes follow the law, they sometimes don't. You find grey hat hackers who find vulnerabilities in websites like Amazon or in Apple, but the way they do that is not entirely legal, because they have to hack a website, which is of course illegal, but they do reveal the vulnerability to the organization. So for some reason, Manning contacted Adrian Lamo and told him about the information that she'd given to WikiLeaks. And then on the 25th of May in 2010, Lamo met with FBI agents and revealed this fact to FBI agents, and then Manning was arrested a couple of days later in 2010 by the FBI. So moving forward to January 2013, she was convicted on charges of espionage and theft and sentenced to 35 years in prison. And you might think, well, that's the end of the story, but no, it's not the end of the story. In January 2017, President Obama commuted all but the last 4 months of her sentence. So she only actually served 5 years of that sentence, and President Obama commuted the rest of it. And whatever you think of that, I have my own definite views. I'll keep my views personal. Whatever you think of that, that's the facts, and that's exactly what happened. I thought I would draw out some. Oh, sorry. Yes, I was going to talk about what the compromised material was. So the compromised material included video strikes of airstrikes in Baghdad, and also included civilian casualties. So I kind of mention that because it's relevant to Manning's state of mind at the time. She was already struggling with her sexuality, and then to see perhaps some horrific videos that pricked at her conscience affected her, I think. She also disclosed 250,000 diplomatic documents, and you can imagine there'd be political sensitivity in those documents, and 500,000 army war logs related to Iraq and Afghan war diaries. And these were diaries of senior personnel within the war who actually fought on the front line in the war. And they were kind of personal as well as having sort of military details within them. She also learned this fact, which again, I didn't know until I read about the case. Of the 100,000 deaths in Iraq at around that time, 60,000 were civilian, and I think that affected her and affected her state of mind. And Manning was stated as saying that, she wanted to show the American people the true cost of war, including the collateral, as she called it, the collateral murder included in the airstrike video, which was released. And I suppose if you Googled it, you could, or if you looked on YouTube, you could find that video. I think it is available to view. I'm not going to do that here, obviously. I think one final point to make is WikiLeaks was embarrassed, WikiLeaks embarrassed the United States government. But a key point is that nobody actually died as a result of the release of that information. And I simply say that because the US government themselves actually admitted that nobody died as a result of it. And it's kind of relevant, but only to people who take the view that journalism is no longer monopolized by traditional media. I have a different view. I won't go into what that view is, but the coining of the phrase below, that journalism is no longer monopolized by traditional media, it seems that these days everybody can be a reporter. So if you don't internally within your companies have some kind of reporting procedure or processes where people can report things that they're concerned about, then there are plenty of reporting processes and procedures outside of the company. For example, I use the Sky News app and the BBC News app to look at the everyday news, and in there is a reporting button, and I can become a reporter just at the click of a button. And that's an important point to note from an insider threat perspective, because if you lose an individual in terms of their loyalty to you, then their loyalty to other people is a fairly easy task for them. I picked out some words here that from the case, and I wanted to talk about these words one by one. And I'm going to start with crown jewels first. And by crown jewels, I mean, do you know where your critical information assets are? So I term coin the phrase crown jewels as meaning my critical information assets. And your first question should be, do you know if you have any critical information assets, and do you know where they are? You then need to assess whether you know what the impact of loss or compromise of those critical assets are. And then you actually need to know where they are on your network. Do you then know who has access to them, and do you know whether they need that access or not? So there's some very fundamental questions about information assets here. And do you know how they're protected and whether they're protected enough? And I use the term protected enough because there is this phrase risk appetite that is commonly used, which is how much risk can we accept? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. So that's the crown jewels aspect of it. And once you've done that, we can talk about access. So Manning was given access to all of this sensitive data. And my questions would be, was that required? Was it necessary for Manning to have access to all of that sensitive data, or indeed any of that sensitive data at all? Even if access was required, surely that access must be regularly reviewed. So for example, we talk about starters, movers, and leavers. So when people start within the company, when someone leaves the company, or when roles change within the company, there ought to be some kind of review of access from an IT and cyber perspective. The need to know principle must extend into the cyber domain as well. So the need to know principle, I'm guessing you'll be familiar with. So it's getting to know information that you need to know for the purposes of your official role. In other words, you couldn't do your job if you didn't know that information. And my point here is that really needs to happen within the cyber domain and the IT domain, as well as within physical domains. So that's access. So the fact that she downloaded these documents. So my first question would be, well, the movement of over 700,000 documents on a network, to me, feels like a very significant network event. And my question would be, is that normal? Was that normal on that particular network? And why did nobody pick it up? And there's probably, you'll have some theories as to why nobody might have picked that up. So that's a good question. And how about normal? What does normal even look like on a network? Do you know on your network what looks like normal? And I'd say for 90 to 95% of our networks here, as a part of a corporate organization, your movements of data are going to happen during the working day, largely speaking. And if you have a massive movement of data outside of that, then that's going to be unusual, and you really ought to have systems in place that pick that up. So that's the timing issue, which is the third bullet point there, is the time of the download unusual. And the other one was, why was CD and DVD writing enabled in the first place? Was that absolutely necessary? So if you don't need to write to CD and DVD, or if you could control that in a different way, then that really should be taken away if you're an organization with a very low risk appetite. And what about other removable media? So for example, USB sticks. And I'll talk about the technical controls around these things in the next few slides later on in the presentation. So that's the issue around downloading information. She disguised and smuggled that information out on a CD and DVD marked Lady Gaga. And that raises some questions for me, because if people had seen that CD or DVD, should that have raised suspicions? Should you have an entry and exit search procedure? And how about a policy on the use of personal media? In other words, should you allow people to bring in or take out personal media? And how about the right to check the contents of removable media that are unrecognized? And actually, there's a legal angle to this as well. Is it even ethically, morally, or legally right for you to be able to do this in the first place? So we have attendees from all over the globe, and I'm guessing there'll be a range of different answers to the legal angle on this particular point, but it really is a question that you do need to answer for yourself. Is there a legal angle to searching people? Okay, so vetting and behavior. By the way, in my company, we remove the ability to use any removable media. So you can't use USB sticks, you can't use CDs, DVDs, that sort of thing. We even control Wi-Fi and Bluetooth to some degree, particularly Bluetooth. But again, you don't have to be that sort of organization. It depends on your risk appetite. Vetting and behavior is very, very important. And the question to ask really yourself is how robust are your vetting procedures? And not just your vetting procedures, because vetting is just a point in time. What about vetting aftercare? What about a year later or 6 months later or 2 years later? Are you able to carry on those vetting aftercare procedures well into employment? Do you train and brief your line managers on such matters? In other words, to look for changes in behavior, that sort of thing. Do you carry out social media checks? Is there any need to carry out social media checks on people? And is it even allowed? So in some countries, doing those sorts of social media checks on individuals that you're going to employ may be a little bit iffy, if you like. So in the case of Bradley Manning, Manning's defense team argued that senior army officers actually missed quite a few red flags. For example, there was an email sent by Manning to his supervisor detailing his personal issues and his confusion over his gender. And he actually attached a picture of himself, dressed in a wig and a lipstick. Now, there's nothing wrong with that from that perspective. But from a managerial perspective, there ought to be some questions asked about, does this individual need some support? Do I need to take this any further? And the supervisor did admit to having concerns over, Manning's mental state. And, there were other incidents where the supervisor found Manning curled up in a fetal position in a supply room with a knife at his feet. And there was also an incident where Manning was being interviewed over something and Manning flipped the table and made towards a gun rack and had to be physically restrained from doing so. So there were quite a few incidents along the way that seemingly nobody seemed to react to. So proper vetting and aftercare procedures may have helped. And then I talk about organizational contributions. Do you have an open and trusting environment with lots of support? Do people feel that they can bring up issues and talk about problems? Again, I'm talking here about making people feel as though they're cared about so that they don't need to go anywhere else to talk about these issues. Is professional help and other support available if needed? And can people raise issues anonymously? Certainly within INS, we have, or I like to think we have an open and trusting environment, and we also have systems in place for medical and mental support and also for raising issues anonymously. So individuals can raise something that they're concerned about. We don't know who's raised it, but we deal with the issue from an anonymous perspective. So what can you do about all of these? I've talked quite a bit about the non-technical indicators here at the top, and I want to get down to the technical indicators now. And from a technical perspective in the cyber world, we talk about prevention, detection, response, and recovery. And under the prevention angle, I hope you can read this, apologies for it being so small. You can prevent issues like this using enterprise risk management, recruitment processes, training and awareness, behavioral standards and expectations, and confidential reporting, and also management training. So you need to train managers to know what to expect and what to look for. On the detection side, and I'm going to go into more detail in the next few slides, there's identification of data, already talked about that, collecting data and analyzing data. On the response side, do you have a cyber incident response plan? If something really bad did happen, if lots of information was compromised, do you have a plan of what you would do under those circumstances? Have you practiced that plan? Have you held exercises? And from a recovery perspective, is there a communications plan? Is your communications department on board, and have they been exercised on this particular plan as well? And is there an impact assessment carried out? And of course, there's the ongoing recovery activities as well. So let's move on to the technical side of things. Just moving on to the next slide, if my machine will cooperate with me. Oh dear. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So you do need to determine what your data requirements are. What is it you need to know about your network and the traffic on your network that would allow you to identify the insider threats that you are most worried about? You need to implement the software that provides such data, and we'll talk about that. And good practice these days is to use some kind of log correlation engine, a security information and event management system to monitor and audit employee actions. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, examples are what I'm going to show to you now. It's called the Gartner Magic Quadrant. If you know Gartner, they're a global organization that look into good practice in IT and cyber and various other aspects. And they look at the market of software that's available, and they, for want of a better word, they assess those in terms of whether they are challengers or leaders or niche players or visionaries. And if you look at the top right-hand corner here, you've got some products here, and I'm not pushing any particular product here. I'm saying that these are the ones that professional organizations might use. There are other ones available as well, and it might actually be that you don't want to use the ones at the top right for a particular reason, for a particular organizational reason. So Splunk, IBM, Exabeam, Logarithm, all of these I'm familiar with from the perspective of knowing their names, but I can't speak for how good they are. Gartner will tell you how good they are. I thought I'd look at some detection indicators in terms of using these types of products. So excessive data upload to file sharing service, top left-hand box there. So if you've got excessive data uploads to places where they shouldn't go, for example, to Dropbox or other large transfers, you can put a limit on that or some kind of parameter on that. I've just given you this as an example. Let's say it's more than 100 uploads or 10 gigabytes or more of data. And there could be a timestamp sort of parameter on that as well. So the data sources from that, usually your web proxy, your next generation firewall, even your DNS and your email gateway. So if you can have a CM, a security information and event management piece of software that draws in the logs from the web proxy and the DNS and the email gateway, you can get it to tell you when unusual things are happening based on your hypothetical parameter. Talking about unauthorized removable media, USB thumb drives, external hard drives, digital cameras. If there's large amounts of data being transferred to any removable media, you can have that as an alarm as well. And actually, if that had been active on the system that Bradley Manning was using at the time, this would have been detected. Now, for all I know, it was detected, but perhaps nobody acted on it. So detection isn't the only thing to consider here. You need a response. So if you detect something happening, somebody needs to respond to that detection. And it could be that Bradley Manning, the Bradley Manning case, that there was a detection, but somebody failed to respond, or there might not have been a detection. I don't know. Excessive data alteration, deletion, and wiping. So if data is changed or if data is deleted or wiped, you can put a parameter on that, and you can use various logs and feed that into the CM software and get, I'm going to give you an example later of what a CM dashboard looks like and what sorts of information you can glean from it. Other ones, attempts to access segregated or escalated file systems or file shares. So, oh, sorry, I've gone ahead. If you've got file shares that are segregated in some way and somebody attempts to access those, then you can set a parameter on that. I've just put 3 attempts here. And again, those are the data sources on the right-hand side. Unauthorized user web activity. So if somebody's accessing hate sites, pornography, pirates websites, job search sites, these are all indicators of, well, the first thing is low productivity. If they're looking at these websites, they're not doing work. But there also could be things around job discontent and potential legal liabilities, because if you're searching for I don't know, hate sites or pornography, then there could be a reputational impact on the company. So you can monitor internet activity as well, and there are some data sources related to that. Transactional triggers on business systems. So it could be that business logic triggers some kind of alarm. So for example, if your financial sanctioning process is somehow suddenly bypassed, then it's possible to get data sources to tell you that somebody has bypassed that. And that could be an early indicator of fraud, for example. Sensitive keyword searching, you can set that as well. And again, there's the data sources for those. You can define whatever sensitive keywords you want to and search for those. Excessive printing, so you can get that from Windows logs as well. And you can set whatever limit you like, 200 pages, 100 pages. And abnormal working hours as well. And actually, with abnormal working hours, you can correlate with physical badges or physical passes that people have, especially if they're coming in and out of buildings. You can get that from the badge card reader logs or from Windows or Unix, depending on your operating system. So those are some of the detection triggers from a cybersecurity perspective that you would kind of look at. I thought I would show you an example of a typical CM dashboard. This is actually Microsoft Azure Sentinel. So this is up in the cloud if you use cloud services. And there's a little bit happening here on this particular page. You can change to different pages here and get different information. This one down here, potential malicious events with the map of the world. Those could be IP addresses that are trying to connect to you, or that a machine inside your network is trying to connect to, and it's known as it's a known bad IP address. So you might think that something is happening there. On the top right hand side, you've got some alerts happening here. The third one down, computers with cleaned event logs. So that's where computers that are keeping logs of what's happening in terms of the security events or user events have been deleted. Now, that is potentially a sign that somebody's cleaning up their tracks. They've done something bad and they're deleting the evidence, they're deleting the logs. So this is just an example. I don't want to go too much into the detail of this, but a CM is very, very useful. It does, however, mean that you can get all of this information, but you have to react to this information as well. I thought I'd give you a second case study, and this is the African Union headquarters. So in 2012, so we've moved on from Chelsea and Bradley Manning now. We're onto a new case here. This is in 2012. There was a hack on the African Union building in Addis Ababa. And actually that wasn't discovered until 2017. And this is relevant to insider threat. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but there was data was exfiltrated every night through the network from midnight to 2 o'clock every night. And it was a pattern that happened every night for 5 years and wasn't noticed for 5 years. And the data was sent to servers in China. I'm merely stating facts here that have been reported. So that data was sent to servers in China. And another thing to note is that the bulk of the computer systems in the building were provided by Huawei and paid for by the Chinese government. Now, you can make whatever conclusion you wish to make about all of that. Actually, they also found some bugs planted in desks and walls as well. You can make whatever conclusion you like about that. But the point for me is that it's an insider threat from a supply chain perspective, because if you have a supply chain providing you with buildings or providing you with network infrastructure, what supply chain assurance have you done? And actually, once that infrastructure is in place, do you then have network monitoring in place so that you could have picked up on this type of activity? So that's the supply chain point. How do you test infrastructure installed by third parties? Do you do penetration testing? Do you do red team kind of events? All of those are really good practice. You shouldn't really trust 100% without verifying. So my mantra in the security world is trust but verify. And what about ongoing network monitoring? So even though you've done the supply chain stuff, you need to do some ongoing network monitoring. And there's the point about response again. It's absolutely critical that you get a response capability also in place. And in my view, for that particular case, a well-managed threat, risk, and detection program would have picked up on that traffic, on that insider traffic, if you like. Some more of the practical steps here for what you might want to do when you go back to your organizations. So for some immediate action, I would understand where your critical assets are, and I would understand how they're stored and who has access to them. And I would map those assets against threats posed by insiders and think about what controls are already existing and what controls are required. And perhaps looking forward 3 to 6 months and beyond, I would establish an insider threat control baseline. In other words, you've done your homework in terms of the threat, the insider threat, and you know what kind of control baseline set you want to deal with that threat. Identify where you have control gaps and obviously fill those gaps, and establish measures and metrics to test the new controls. So you can't rely on the controls just working 100%, just flicking a button and then just sitting back and relaxing. This requires constant maintenance. And start receiving network intelligence and begin to respond to alerts. So those are my kind of, what sort of things do you need to do as you go forward beyond this presentation? I want to conclude this now because I think we're approaching the 45-minute mark. So by saying that good practice in cybersecurity insider threats certainly requires that you identify, protect, detect, and respond and recover. So these are standard terms that we use in cybersecurity. I use them as part of the Nist framework. So if you Google Nist framework, Nist cybersecurity framework, you will get some information on that good practice area. Insider threat control selection should be driven by the threat. So it should be you thinking, I think I have a threat from a following perspective, and therefore I need the following controls in place. Also, in my view, no system is foolproof and all systems are hackable. So in other words, even when you do all of this stuff, there's going to be some residual risk, and the trick is to know what residual risk that you can tolerate. And the other thing for me is that nothing remains static in cyber. So I would stay alert. I would be informed around the latest cyber threats. I would listen to your IT and cyber security professionals, but I would also challenge them as well. Sometimes in the cyber world, where we do have a blinkered way of thinking, we can sometimes do that, and it's good to be challenged. I think challenge is a positive thing in that context. And that's me concluding my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I think we have time for some questions. I do have a difficult Wi-Fi connection here. It's unreliable, and I'm hoping that this will work.
Thanks, Kesh. No, excellent job there. And some of the questions and thoughts I was compiling as you were going through your session, I think you addressed very well at the end, like what can people do? What can people do there? One thing which strikes me, Everybody, thank you for joining us. If you do have any Q&A, questions and answers, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you're using a laptop. Alternatively, you may have to toggle if you're using your phone. But please use the Q&A button rather than the chat function so we can ask Kesh directly. But while you're thinking of your questions and putting them in, Kesh, one thing which struck me as we were going through was that I know this was from an IT perspective, which we asked you, but it seems like there's so much more, particularly from the mental health aspect, or even not mental health. If, for example, someone's motivated by money, perhaps colleagues or people spotting unexplained wealth or changes in spending patterns, and the like. Is there anything in your experience which we can use to get companies can use to start joining those dots? Is there a link we can have perhaps between IT, but also security or human resources or anyone? How can you get other people to be aware of this as well and join it up together?
Yeah, okay. So there's some really good advice from the CPNI here in the United Kingdom. And much of it is publicly available. I can certainly, by the end of this, provide a link to attendees. But there's, as you rightly pointed out, this is much bigger than cybersecurity, and there are a lot of other aspects to this, mental health and behavior and so on and so forth. And all of those are covered within the CPNI Good Practice Guide. So I'm quite happy to provide that later. One example from a practical perspective is organizational change. So when organizational change occurs, it sometimes people act differently because they feel threatened, or they might feel their job is threatened because of organizational change. And it's very important if you're going through that organizational change. And I've been through it a couple of times, and I've been advising my company on what we need to do in response in order to detect individual problems as and when they might arise. And if you have any programs for organizational change, you really must speak to your cybersecurity and personnel security professionals and get advice from them about whether people's motivations might change, because that's an indicator of a potential insider threat. And if people's motivations change, then it's potentially possible they could do something that you didn't want them to do in the first place. So it's very important to anticipate these sorts of things.
No, thank you, Kesh. Absolutely, I think anticipation, and I think as well, through some of the research we've done at King's, I think communication between the executive and the like. So I was happy that we had so many managers on the call. So hopefully the managers can go away and start thinking about integrating this into a comprehensive approach. Kesh, we had a question from Tamir. Tamir, are there any publicly available technical guides on how to establish an IT protection system? I know you mentioned CPNI, but anything else which comes to mind?
Okay, there's a good practice guide that's released by the SANS Institute, and actually some of the material I have for this presentation is from that good practice guide. It is a PDF document. It is available on the internet. I will also provide a link to that. I'm just going to make a note of it. So Timur, if you're listening, I'm happy to provide that to you as well. I think you have a second question there. Would it be possible to have a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. I think we're going to release that, are we?
Yes. The presentation will be released, as will this recording, which will be available on YouTube shortly after the presentation. We just need to edit it to take out some of the excess bits, but yeah, absolutely, that'll be online.
Okay.
Excellent. Kesh, oh yeah, thank you, you're welcome. Another question about insider threats are tricky to detect in the era of outsourcing, globalization, and rapid technical techniques. Do you have any thoughts? Joshi, do you mean thoughts on globalization, thoughts on outsourcing, or how to detect them in this environment? I've just confirmed. Cash, can you see the Q&A with it?
Yes, I can. Yes. So I think the question is, with so much outsourcing and globalization, how do we deal with the insider threat? And I think the way to do that is supply chain management and supply chain assurance. So within the company that I work for, we have a supply chain assurance program, and we rank our suppliers in terms of the risk that they would pose to us if something went wrong. So for example, if we had a supplier where we were supplying critical data to in order for them to process it in some way, and we're providing lots of that data to them, then I would class them as a high-risk supplier. I would then be assuring myself that they have systems and procedures in place that that would protect my information in their infrastructure. And the way that I view it in my head is the envelope of protection that I afford my information in my network, I need to extend that envelope of protection into the outsourced company. It's not an easy job. You need to know exactly what questions you need to ask to assure yourself that they will protect that information. It is resource intensive, but it does address risk. And on the point of risk, you actually also need to know how much risk you can tolerate, because it goes back to one of the points I made, which was, you know, there's no such thing as 100% security. So if you know your risk appetite, and if you know your supplier and get your assurance questioning of that supplier correct, then it's possible to be in a position where you might be able to accept the risk of doing that.
Thanks, Cash. We've got, I think, two questions on the Q&A, but also a couple of raised hands from attendees. So attendees, if you could please answer via the Q&A or ask your questions via the Q&A, that will just help us queue them. But thank you. Cash, over to you. Are you happy with the next set?
The next question, is that from Jeffrey? I've got here.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so please comment on how you would manage an insider threat posed by a sysadmin potentially aiming at sabotage rather than data exfiltration. More vetting, but how to tackle the challenge if there are ones establishing the network rules and systems. Okay, so this is about if you have somebody on your network who, let's say, has, I'm just going to use the phrase God rights. In other words, they can do pretty much anything that they absolutely want to. The way to deal that with any sort of, even in the physical world, the way to deal with that is to have some kind of oversight. So not just have one person doing that job, but perhaps having 2 or 3 people doing that job, so that there's a little bit of oversight. They can't make a change without going through some kind of change management procedure, for example, that other people have to attend. So that's probably the first thing I would look at, and also capturing logs of events that have occurred will help if something actually did occur. I think it goes back to my point of you have to accept a certain amount of risk. If you've done the vetting of the individual, if you trust that individual, if you have a 2-man rule, we call it the 2-man rule, if you have procedures in place, if you have change management and change boards in place, then I think you go a long way to reducing that particular risk.
Thanks, Cash, and thanks, Jeffrey, for the question. Excellent. We have a couple of others in there, although we are running out of time. So if you, we're coming up to the hour, so please do ask your questions. But Cash, thank you so much for your time so far. Are you happy just to answer the last few, so we're on time?
Yeah, indeed. So I think there's a question here from Mac. Hi, Mac. Nice to see you again. Whether a properly implemented integrated management system or quality management system can help in detecting presence of insider threat. So I think we make the mistake in organizations sometimes of doing things in isolation, doing cybersecurity in isolation, or doing quality in isolation, or doing procurement in isolation. The reality is that all of these things are interconnected, and it requires you know, a mesh of collaboration between the different departments. So I absolutely agree with you that that the QMS could be a way that you do that, or an integrated management system could be a way that you do that. And I applaud that approach, actually, the consolidated approach. I think that deals with a lot of risk, yes.
Oh, thanks, Kesh. So we have two more in there, and one actually from a chat function. Kesh, can I ask you the chat function one, just so I don't forget it?
Yes, the chat function. Just hang on.
Oh no, so I can read it out. But thank you, Karul, for your question.
Yeah.
But basically, since the variation of the threat goes from physical protection is not enough anymore because we're facing insider and cyber. How can your organization deter those matters? And are there any case studies you can share on this? Thanks, Karul.
So case studies on cyber insider threat?
I think case studies on good cyber practice from a organization's perspective.
Oh, okay. So this is a much wider question about cybersecurity practice, not just insider threat. Then, I would look at international frameworks for managing cybersecurity. Excuse me, ISO 27001 is a standard, a cybersecurity standard that you could potentially look at. I've decided personally that ISO 27001 isn't right for my company as we currently stand. I use the Nist cybersecurity framework with the 5 strands of identify, protect, detect, and I forget the other 2 now, but I talked about them in the presentation. I use the Nist framework in order to do that, and I build in the insider threat into that Nist framework. Again, I can provide the link to the Nist cybersecurity framework. If you Google it, you'll probably find it on the Nist website in America. There are other standards or other frameworks you could use. There's the Australian Signals Directorate Top 20 Security Controls. There's the CIS Top the Australian Signals Directorate is 34 controls. The CIS framework is 20 controls. So there's quite a few you can use. I find the Nist framework the easiest to use and the most flexible, should I say, that's a better word, the most flexible to use for my company.
Thanks, Kesh. I know we're coming up to the hour, so we do have a couple of questions left, but I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer them. It's simply just a matter of timekeeping. But what I can say, just for G. Leslie, I know you're asking, I think, about the balance between well-being, but also company national responsibilities of maintaining the law. Absolutely, I think these concerns need to be balanced. These are wider questions outside of IT perspective, but they're questions about the link and the social contract between your various countries and organizations and the extent of intelligence in there. But I think within companies, as Kesh said, an integrated approach where executives are able to talk to each other from human resources, for IT, from security, to discuss issues, and prevention is better than cure. So if someone reports an issue or someone observes a colleague is going through a bad time, then being able to discuss that in a free manner internally without fear of repercussion is, I think, a healthy perspective, and one which will do a lot of good for a company as a whole, but also added benefits for security. Sorry, Kesh, that's a bit of a roundup. But just to say thank you so much, Kesh, for lending us your expertise today.
You're very welcome.
I really enjoyed that, and I hope everyone. Thanks, Kesh. I really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else did too. So just after this, we're going to send around a survey. Please do let us know your thoughts in that survey. It's great for us to find out if you're enjoying them or not. We're looking forward to seeing you hopefully at the next webinar as well. That's going to be in the new year. That's going to be on 28th of January, where we'll be joined by Christine Newland. And she's going to be talking about establishing an insider threat program, but also how we can start measuring that maturity and how we can start measuring the effectiveness of those programs too. So Kesh, thank you once again for lending us your expertise. Thank you everyone for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you all in the new year. Thanks everybody. Goodbye.